Okay, morning everyone. Today is Tuesday, and today we are going to be looking at the meaning of the poem London, line by line, going through it just to make sure we're all clear on what the poem means. But first of all, we're going to recap some of the context that we learned about yesterday. So there are 4 questions in front of you on the screen, and they are printed also on the worksheet. So what I want you to do is go away and answer those questions, then come back and we will go through the answers together. Okay. Right, so you should have written the answers to those questions on your worksheet now. So, question 1, what was unusual about Blake as a child? Now, you could have several things for this, but the main thing that I would say is his religious visions. They're the thing that kind of sets him apart. When he saw Jesus, saw God peering in through the window aged 4, and then aged 9 when he saw a tree full of angels in the middle of London. So those things kind of make him quite unusual. And then you've also got the fact that he was homeschooled. He didn't actually attend a normal school. He learned a lot of he was educated at home by his mother quite a lot. He grew up in London. Question 2. That's key to understanding this poem. He's from London. He grew up there. He's very much immersed in the culture of the city. Question 3. Which collection of poetry is London from? Now, remember yesterday we talked about Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. London is from Songs of Experience. And remember that we said that London doesn't have an equivalent poem in Songs of Innocence, whereas a lot of the poems, there's a corresponding poem in each of the collections. But London is from Songs of Experience, so you can remember that. And we talked about how that reflected kind of like the fall from grace of humanity, the sin being in the world and all that sort of thing. Number 4, which historical events influenced Blake to write London? So you've got a choice there of 3 things, and you should have picked the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. You could have also had some more specific things if you'd thought about it, like the Gordon riots that we discussed in a brief detail yesterday, among other things. So there you go. There are the answers for those context recap questions. Brilliant. Right, so what we're going to do now is we will go through the poem line by line just to make sure that we're all clear on the meaning of the poem before we start doing any analysis. So, okay, stanza 1. Let's just read stanza 1 again. I wander through each charted street, near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Okay, so I've highlighted some of the things that we're going to talk about in this stanza in yellow. So I wander through each charted street. Now the speaker in the poem uses the word I to talk about themselves. So we could think that the speaker is Blake himself, or it could possibly be a character that Blake has created. But the themes and the political kind of opinions in this poem very much represent Blake. So we can kind of assume that the speaker in the poem is Blake. And then we've got this word charted. So I wander through each charted street near where the charted Thames doth flow. It's been used as an adjective here to describe the streets and the Thames. Now, charted is an interesting word. So it kind of means like laws or contracts. It could refer to laws or contracts kind of drawn up to spell out the rights of the city or guild. But it could also refer to maps. But within this kind of idea of the streets being chartered and the river being chartered, there's a lack of freedom there, because it's all about like the laws and the rights of the city of London rather than its people. So, right. So Blake's not walking through London as a free man, he's walking through London as a chartered man, somebody whose freedoms and restrictions have been written down in law in a charter. Okay. And mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now, in this line, Blake's just saying that the people that he sees in the streets of London are clearly unhappy. You can see it in their faces. In their faces, there are marks of woe, and woe is just a evocative word for unhappiness. Now, in Blake's time, that could have been kind of like the marks of disease as well, because London in 1790 was a very horrible place to live in terms of disease and poverty and famine. So all of those things you might have seen in the people's faces. So marks of woe and marks of weakness. Now, stanza 2, done that in purple. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Okay, so in stanza 2, Blake's introducing us to all the sounds that he can hear as he's walking through the city. So every cry of every man, every infant's cry of fear, every voice in every ban. So all of these things are sounds that he can hear as he walks through the city. Now, ban, as you know, is like a prohibition. You can be banned from using your Xbox, or you know what I mean. So every cry of every ban, children crying in fear. So Blake can hear that as he's walking through the city of London, suggesting it's not a very nice place to grow up as a child. Other things he can hear are men crying, but then we've got this interesting phrase, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Just going to have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So mind-forged manacles. Now manacles, done a little illustration for you there, are is another word for chains, basically, or like handcuffs, or something that could prevent you from moving and limit your freedom. But they're mind-forged. Now forge means made, so this phrase means made in the mind. So the mind-forged manacles. Now that's interesting because we're kind of asking ourselves, how could you create chains in your mind? And maybe Blake's saying something about the mindset of the people in the city of London. Maybe they limit their freedom in their own minds by creating these manacles. But he could also be referring to like poverty and disease and all the things that keep them chained in their real lives. But remember what we said about Blake in the context lesson yesterday, and how he liked to blur the lines between imagination and reality. Now, these manacles are not real, they're not real chains, but they are real in the sense that they impact on the lives of the people in London. So they limit their freedoms, even though they only exist within their minds. So that's an interesting stanza. Right, stanza 3. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Now this is my personal favourite stanza. I think it's got lots of powerful images in it that we'll discuss now. So, how the chimney sweepers cry. So Blake's still hearing these things at this point. He's hearing the cry of a chimney sweeper. Now, Blake is kind of obsessed with this figure of the chimney sweep, and he writes 2 poems about chimney sweeps specifically in Songs of Innocence and Experience that you can go away and read if you want to. But he sees the chimney sweep as a kind of symbol of the bad things about the Industrial Revolution and the exploitation of children, because chimney sweeps were very often were very often young children. And it was a very dirty and dangerous job, and they would often get stuck up chimneys in the very narrow flues, and many children developed cancer as a result of their work as chimney sweeps, because they were exposed to so many carcinogenic things when they're up the chimney, like ash and smoke and stuff. So it's very sad story about these chimney sweeps, and Blake's really taken by it, and he uses the chimney sweep as a symbol for the ills of the Industrial Revolution in a lot of his poetry. But what's their link then with the church? Because Blake then goes on to talk about how the cry appalls every blackening church. So the link between chimney sweepers and the church is that oftentimes those children who did end up being chimney sweeps were orphans, or those children who were in the care of the church. So the church itself was kind of like allowing these terrible things to happen to these poor orphan children. So we can move back and have a look at that verb appalled and kind of understand it a bit better, because either we could argue the church is being appalled, they're being embarrassed by their behaviour, or that they are appalled by the things that are happening. Or Blake is appalled, even. It could be a criticism of the church. Now, we've got this idea of the blackening church. Now, blackening suggests it's like rotting or maybe covered in soot from the chimney. So that could be a reference to the Industrial Revolution, because what happened a lot of times in big cities in the Industrial Revolution was that buildings would turn black as a result of all the soot that was going into the air and the smoke from the factories. So that could be like a kind of visual image that Blake's trying to draw on, but it could also be a criticism of the church, because blackening kind of suggests rotting or like evil. So it could be a criticism of the church for allowing something like that to happen to the children of the City of London. And then we've got this even more powerful line. And the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Now that's a really interesting one, and we're going to look at that now. So hapless means either unfortunate or powerless. So the soldier is being described as unfortunate or powerless. So it kind of shows us that Blake is anti-war, because at that time England is very militaristic. There's a very kind of gung-ho spirit in terms of like conflict and war. And it wouldn't have necessarily been that fashionable to describe a soldier as unfortunate or powerless. But we've got that theme running through the poem. If we look back to stanza 1 and think about the chartered streets and the chartered Thames and the mind-forged manacles, Blake's harping on about the powerlessness of the people of London in this poem. So the fact that he describes a soldier as powerless is no surprise. And then you've got the palace. So hapless soldiers' cries run in blood down palace walls. Now the palace is being used here as a symbol for government, like we call the House of Commons the Palace of Westminster or the Palace of Whitehall. Those are the seats of government. But it could also be referring directly to royalty, that those people who live in palaces. But we can see that the blood running down the palace walls suggests like that the palace or the government has blood on their hands. They're responsible for the bloodshed of military conquests, or even just simply for the suffering of the people in London. And you really can see Blake's anti-monarchical stance coming out here. He does not like the government. He does not like the king and the queen and their power being imposed on the people in that way. So he's saying, look, you guys, there's blood running down your palace walls in the form of a soldier's sigh. Now that's clearly a metaphor there, because we know that sighs can't run in blood down palace walls, but the soldier's probably speaking of his experiences in the war, and that's representative of the suffering that he has seen, this running in blood. I think that's a really powerful image. Now, stanza 4, last stanza, we're almost there. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Now, these are the most famous lines of this poem. They are the most often quoted. And Blake's kind of saying, he's returning to the sounds of the city and saying, the loudest sound I can hear, the most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts a newborn infant's cry. Now, harlot's another word for prostitute. So he's kind of saying that he can hear a prostitute cursing or telling her baby off for crying. Now, it could be her baby or it could be someone else's baby, but that's not very important. But what Blake's trying to say is that this baby has been born into a corrupt world. He's not being comforted when he cries. He's being cursed. He's being told off. So that's kind of a comment on like the state of the world for children and what it was like to be born into London in the 1790s. But also blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Now we've got these two words, blight and plague, which refer to disease. Now you can get like potato blight, and you know what plague is, swept through England in just actually a few hundred years earlier, so it's quite a modern reference for Blake really. It suggests that prostitution can lead to disease within a marriage, so it blights with plagues the marriage hearse. And this could be referring to venereal disease, which is like an STI, which was a big problem at the time. But it could also be kind of talking about like the moral character of the city and the fact that prostitution is a big problem and it's really impacting on the marriages within the city. And you've got this interesting oxymoronic phrase, marriage hearse. Now, oxymoron kind of means as in like an internal contradiction within the phrase. And we can say that this is an oxymoron because a hearse is a funeral car. You wouldn't see a hearse at a wedding usually. So that's kind of an oxymoron because marriage itself represents kind of like life and union, and you often have children within a marriage, whereas a hearse obviously represents death. So it could be arguing that like marriage is like a death, the marriage hearse. Some people might argue that marriage is like that, or it could just be, like I said earlier, a reflection on like the morals of the city of London and how they're being torn apart, or the marriage is being torn apart by this kind of plague of prostitutes in the city of London. So there we go. That is a line by line understanding of London, the poem. So you've listened to that now, and what I want you to do is go away and complete the questions for task 2, which is they're just designed to consolidate what we've talked about here. Okay, have a lovely day.